Hey everyone, I'm here today with Lipman, who is an artist from the Los Angeles area, San Francisco area, but is now in Chicago studying his MFA in painting there. Ish, do you want to give a little more background of who you are, where you're coming from, where some of your imagery is coming from and whatnot?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my name is Ish. Full name is Ishmael. My parents named me after Moby Dick, but I've kind of just gone by Ish. Yeah, grew up basically in California, born in San Francisco, raised in LA, and then I went to undergrad at UC Santa Cruz, and then after that, took like a year off, and then got to go to Skowhegan in 2019. Came back to LA, then basically applied to graduate school, and then now I am about to enter my last semester of grad school. So
Awesome. Tell
yeah,
me, let's talk a little bit more about your time in Santa Cruz.
yeah,
Previous conversation, you kind of talked about how um, living there kind of made you take a more transition into painting and what the landscape was like and how that was like could have been inspirational to you in taking that step towards painting.
yeah, definitely. So before I went to UC Santa Cruz, I was mainly doing photography. I think before I moved, I always admired painting and painters, but I didn't think that I was capable of painting for some reason. And then I transferred schools and had to like make up all these credits that I kind of had. I don't know, like transferring from one school to another. There's like always a headache. And I had to take a painting class essentially to graduate. And I was like, well, I love painting. I'm going to take this class. Just, it was like I didn't take the class thinking I was going to end up becoming a painter. I just took it out of like my love for painting. And I had a really encouraging teacher, and I found that painting offered me something that I wasn't quite getting from photography. I really liked photography, but I wanted something that I could like really work on, like a craft.
Mm,
And photography is a craft, definitely. But I think that painting was like, if I could draw, like I could literally work on it like whenever I had a spare moment. And it had like a physical kind of involvement with my body that I just did not have with photography.
mm,
And that quickly kind of just like slowly took over like most of my free time. And then what also started to happen, I mean, growing up, I spent like, I guess I was, since I was like 3, I'm like 26 now. So, most of my life I was in LA that whole time. And like it's a pretty urban, not super urban, but like in a city. And then suddenly being in Santa Cruz was a massive change. Just being around the redwood trees, being around the ocean, it slowed down my way of interacting with the world. And then that opened up the worlds that I kind of investigate in painting, I would say. I think I owe it largely to that landscape. Also to LA too, but the slowing down enabled me to kind of dive into my own world as opposed to kind of being on the edges of other people's worlds, which I feel like happens a lot when you're in LA. And that stillness is something that I think I still kind of seek to ground myself in
mhm.
wherever I am. But I'm grateful that I had that time in Santa Cruz to ground myself.
Yeah. That's great. And when you talk about like stillness and like the pause that can exist when you're in that kind of well, where you're in any location, but kind of like taking in what what that is for you personally. And then I know that you've talked about um again in a previous conversation just how you have a lot of surrealist influences and kind of like thinking about um like surreal as being a pause. Like what is the surreal really? How do you kind of come to think about it? Because when we hear that term, typically we think of Dali or other artists that have Magritte, or it's something, the uncanny and what the uncanny can mean, how it can open up different possibilities of thought process or of like a even kind of like an aesthetic experience. How do you kind of approach the surreal in your work, or do you think you're doing that, or like
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I'm maybe like on the fringes of surrealism would be
yeah,
a way to put it, but I think I grew up with my mom showing me like Leonora Carrington and Dorothea Tanning paintings, I definitely gravitate more towards the women
Mhm.
surrealists than the men. I saw like a retrospective of Magritte, and like I liked those images when I was a kid, and then I saw them in person, and I think that Instagram, like they're so flat that
Mhm.
Instagram kind of just like destroyed them for me. Like I'm like he to me now, like I'm just not interested in looking at those paintings. Like they're amazing and technically well done, but there's just, they all seem like one-liners,
Yeah.
and they've grown a bit stale over time for me. And then same with Dali. But I think that maybe like when I was younger, it really kind of it captured something that I was interested in. And I think that going back to surrealism as a moment of pause for me, it's more that I think anchoring yourself in your own world. Like I feel like Dorothea Tanning and Leonora Carrington like very much anchored themselves in their own world.
Yeah.
And for me, that's like the surreal aspects are important, but it's more just evidence that they were kind of living in their own universe, and not in like a completely disconnected way, but in a way that maybe helped them engage with the world. I'm actually right now just reading a book written by Dorothea Tanning's niece, I think. And it kind of just like, I mean, it seems like she like had the opportunity in her life like multiple times to get famous or at least more recognized than she did. And she passed these up, I think, in part just to really do her own thing. And I think that to me, maybe surrealism is more emblematic of that, of it's just kind of allowing yourself to not necessarily follow certain trends. I mean, ironically now I feel like surrealism is associated with trends and being on trend, but and maybe that's kind of what makes it almost like a dirty word, at least in grad school. I think there's it's like, I've heard people be like, I hate surrealism. Like it's this thing that's seen either as, I mean, in my opinion, it's either seen as too dirty or people kind of give into it too gratuitously.
Mm.
Like I think that there's people who just fully lean into it and it becomes like a cliche.
Yeah.
And then there's people who completely abstain from it. And I want to be somewhere in between, which is why I think that my paintings, like I consider myself on the fringe of it. Like I'm more interested in the feeling of when you're about to kind of fall into one of those worlds, but you haven't quite fallen in yet. And then
Yeah.
I think that there's like a disorientation that occurs.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a state that I'm more interested in
Yeah.
than, yeah, cultivating my own like extreme fantasy world.
In most of your recent paintings there are figures. Do you want to talk about that? Is that is that important to have the figures there? Are they representative of anything?
Yeah, definitely. Figures, I would say, I mean, I painted figures in my like very early paintings, and then for a little bit in grad school, I kind of wanted to take them out because I didn't want to like see. I wanted to see what would happen if I removed them. But the figures are essentially like a stand-in for myself, or I like scale is like very important to me.
Mm.
Like I'd like people to be able to place themselves within my paintings.
Yeah.
And when I remove the figures entirely, it's like a little, it becomes a little too empty. And I think that the figures also are a little, they hint at an idea of a narrative. And that to me is also important. Maybe before I mentioned, I think Julio Cortázar is like a writer who I really admire. Um, I like narratives that are somewhat winding and confusing, but that don't have like complete, they don't resolve themselves entirely. And so for me, the figures are kind of this gateway to explore or at least open up the possibility of a narrative without forcing a narrative on someone. And I think for me, going back to painting, I think that really is a gift of painting, is that it can imply these narratives and yet it leaves interpretation open to people.
Hmm.
Especially I think now with Instagram and everything, like so many things are like over defined potentially, like, and then from that like intense definition of like events and things, everything kind of becomes almost in some ways more cryptic because there's just so much information.
Right.
And I think giving less information honestly is more pleasant in my opinion. Like it's more of a gift to give someone because then they take something and sit with it for a while. Going off of that, something I think that maybe I think about a lot too, it's